I'm Patrick Byers with University of Missouri Extension. In this video, we're going to talk about water use in producing crops as we grow crops in the farm or in the garden. We'll first talk about the sources of water that are used for irrigation. We'll talk about the relative risks associated with each of those sources. We'll then talk about the ways that we irrigate. We'll talk about trickle and overhead irrigation. And finally, we'll end up with a discussion of hoses. Not all hoses are created equal. We'll talk about potable water hoses and non-potable water hoses. The water that we use to produce crops typically comes from one of three sources. A common source is municipal water. This is water that is regularly tested and is delivered by a city, a town, a county, or a water authority. This water is safe. It can be used for many purposes, including irrigation and also in harvest and post-harvest. The second source that is sometimes used on farms and in gardens is well water. Well water is typically safe, but unless it's tested, you can't make that assumption. So it's important to test well water to understand its safety. And the final source is surface water. And an example of surface water that is frequently used in gardens or on farms is rainwater that is collected off of surfaces. Now, surface water is open to the environment. It almost always carries some level of biological contamination. Always remember that the water that we use during harvest and post-harvest must be potable water, drinking water quality. But we can use surface water if it's not too heavily contaminated to irrigate crops. There are two typical ways that we irrigate crops on the farm or in the garden. Those are either a drip or trickle system or an overhead sprinkler. With drip or trickle, the water is applied directly to the soil and the above ground part of the plant is not contacted by the irrigation water. In the case of sprinklers, the entire plant is wetted with the irrigation water. If there's any question about the safety of the water, drip or trickle is the safest way to irrigate because, again, the above ground part of the plant stays dry. Now, this margin of safety isn't there with crops that are very close to the soil or crops such as root crops that contact water beneath the soil. But in general, drip or trickle is considered to be a safer way to irrigate crops on the farm or in the garden. Not all hoses are created equal. There are two typical types of hoses that we use in the farm or in the garden. The first type, the standard garden hose, is sometimes called a non-potable water hose. And this type of hose is just fine for taking water to irrigate a bed or a field. But anytime we need to have potable water, drinking water, quality water, it's important to use a potable water hose. For example, water that might be used for washing hands, for cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, or for rinsing vegetables should be delivered using a potable water hose. So in conclusion, when we think about the water that we use to grow crops, we first want to consider where that water comes from. The three sources, be it municipal, well water, or surface water. We also want to think about the way that we irrigate crops. Do we use a drip or a trickle system, or do we use overhead irrigation? And finally, we want to use the right type of hose for the right purpose. Non-potable water hoses are fine for irrigating, potable water hoses for any sort of process that requires potable water. I'm Patrick Byers, Horticulture Field Specialist and Produce Food Safety Specialist with University of Missouri Extension.